Okay, so we haven't gotten to the beginning of the civil rights movement yet, and some of the readings are going to take us a bit out of chronological order. So just FYI, that don't think of things necessarily in chronological order, where some of the readings are going to be more thematic in nature, especially because the reading for today from Caste was, it's not really about a particular time period, right? This part 3 is pillars of the caste. It's really more about what, let me remember, I think it's Edwards. No, it's about Wilkerson, about what she's arguing in this book. And I have to be honest, when I first saw that she was publishing a second book, her first book was a hit. It was a bestseller and all of that. But when I first saw that she was going to publish a book called Caste, I initially thought that it was going to book I was going to dislike, because it sounded like she was going to argue that class was more important than race for understanding the political and social dynamics in the United States. And while I really enjoy having those discussions about what themes are more relevant in certain situations, I thought a whole book arguing that, I don't know. Except that's not what she's arguing here at all. Right? Did anybody catch, or, if you didn't read the earlier part of the book that I didn't assign, you might not have caught on to what her argument is. But has anybody caught on to what Wilkerson's argument is?
Well, she's arguing the whole definition of caste, like of the word itself. I mean, is that what you're asking?
Yes, right. Because she names the book Caste for a reason. She's making a big argument about caste and why that word is relevant to the U.S. Ricardo just puts part of it in the chat. Yes, that America has a caste system. And Nathan's further elaborating, a racial caste system. Yes, and because the word, we don't think of it as applying to American history or to the dynamics in the United States. We think of it as Indian, right? The caste system in India, right, which has existed for a really long time. But what she's saying here is that's a word that applies to understanding a race system in the United States, right? In that sense, then, if we really got to understand these pillars of caste that she's talking about in the section for today and understand the argument she's going to go on to make, we need to kind of understand what her definition of caste is, right? Most of us probably don't think about that word on a regular basis, but can anybody help us try to define what caste, according to Wilkerson, is? I'm like, you read the pillars. And those are elements of it, right? This is what she's saying are the core elements of a caste. But yeah, Mary?
I know that she uses the reference a lot about the Indian, about the horses. And like, as far as like, she does reference that a lot, but I don't know if that's what she means, but she does reference that a lot.
Yeah, we can talk about that, but Ricardo's helping us out in the chat. A hierarchy. This is what she means by caste. She means a hierarchy. Yes. And actually, let me share my screen so I can show you part of the reading I didn't assign. It's earlier in chapter 6, but where she actually goes in and defines caste for us. What a good scholar, especially if her whole argument is going to be based around this word, she has to define it for us, right? Because we might each have a very different understanding of what it is. And here she's telling us, okay, this is what I mean by it, given her understanding of American history and of Indian history, right? Because she's borrowing this word from India, and not that it was originally an Indian word, but from our understanding of the hierarchy system in India. So let me go ahead and share this and pull up. So this is from chapter 6. If you're following along in the actual physical book, this is, let me pull up the page. It's page 67 in the book. And in the PDF version of it that Mary gave us all, I downloaded it. It's page 62 in the PDF, right? But here she's giving us telling us exactly what she means by caste, right? And she starts off by saying it's synonymous with India, right? She talks here about how it originated by the Portuguese. The word comes from Portugal, and based on what they saw in what's happening in India, right? But it's a concept of rankings, right? Hierarchy. That's all it really means at its core, the way Wilkinson is defining it, saying that kind of hierarchy and rankings of people, though, applies to the US if we think of race as being those categories within a pyramid of a hierarchy. Right, within those rankings that in India, it's not so much about race, although race plays a role in the caste system in India. It's not an accident that the lower caste tend to have darker skin. But in the US, it's very explicitly, she says, a hierarchy system based on race. Right? And I'll go over here and talk. And she says, we're talking about racism as being the core of the US. Right? It's not, we're not talking about class here, although class, she's going to intersect notions of class and how they play with race. She says we're talking about racism, right? And so she does talk a little bit about racism here. I'm gonna skip some of this so we can get down to where she's talking, giving us more explicitly more information about her idea of caste, right? She says caste predates the notion of race. Right? She's saying this idea of hierarchy, it existed before ideas of race, right? The way we define race today is actually a very modern definition, and especially the way that Wilkerson talks about it. What she's talking about is a race-based system that comes out of the Atlantic slave trade. Right? So it's very modern concept. Ideas about race don't really exist in the ancient world, for example. But she says in the system of race that comes into existence, we can connect it to this idea of caste, right? Let's see. She says, the modern day version of easily deniable racism may be able to cloak the invisible structure that created and maintains hierarchy and inequality. But caste does not allow us to ignore structure. Caste is structure, right? So this is what has come up in the chat already is absolutely correct. What we're talking about here is a structure, a ranking, or we can kind of translate most of that to just mean hierarchy, right? A system of hierarchy, right? But it's not something that's always set in stone, right? She goes on to say caste is a living, breathing entity, right? It is like a corporation that seeks to sustain itself at all cost, right? But that, it means that it can sometimes change. It's not set in stone. It can sometimes change. It can adjust, right? And then this is also useful to think about. Caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. I think that is very useful to understanding her pillars, the way she talks about the pillars, right? Because in her 8 pillars, she goes on to kind of go into these bits one by one. So what do you think? If that, that's a summary of her argument, right? She's saying that in the United States, there exists a hierarchy based on race that withholds status and kindness to people. So let me stop sharing this. And yeah, Mary?
That's it. Kind of goes it goes a little bit further on how people, I guess, hold on, let me gather my thoughts. Basically, it goes on how people treat people like further down, because that's basically like her determining or defining how people treat people, because like that's how that's the way that people are like, how do I say this? That's the way that's like setting the guidelines on how people are treating others. Because like if you don't have respect, or if you don't have any sort of status, people are not going to address you. Because like further down in the
Yeah.
book, she's like, oh, that people don't even shake people's hands. And like some little girl touched the little girl's hand, and like the mom like freaked out and like washed her hand, and like she started crying, and like I guess like throwing like a panic attack or something. Like, so she's like, that's where like you have no, you're like a disease, you're diseased or something. So that's where like you have no sort of status. Like you don't even, they don't even shake your hand. Like if you drink from a cup, they break the cup because you like infect the cup. So it's like you have no, there's no respect for you. Like, and the people can't even drink from the same thing, and like you can't even walk behind them and stuff. So that's where
Yeah.
that defines like your status. It defines your privilege. It defines like your social status. So
Yeah, and that is how that hierarchy is maintained, right? How do you make sure that the people at the bottom stay at the bottom? It's how you treat them, right? How the whole society is organized to treat them, right? And those are where the examples she brings in come into explaining how this system of caste works in the United States, while comparing it to these other places, right? So what do you think overall of her use of that word caste, and the overall argument? Just, just right now with the quick definition we put together, do you like it? Is it a useful way to trying to understand the history of the United States and racism, or do you find it a little bit too uncomfortable, too weird to use that word?
I guess it's so weird. Yeah.
Mary says weird as well. What? Mhm. Oh, you're going to say, or why? Why? Those of you that find it a little bit weird, what's so weird about
I
it?
can say that because I compare with where I live in Brazil, there is no caste like in United States. Yeah. Or because in Brazil, for example, if you go to Brazil, just Japanese, Chinese, you are part of the community. It's not like you are Japanese, your origin is ground is from China. No, if you go to Brazil, you are Brazilian. Yeah, this for me sounds this way. Yeah.
Okay, and I've seen people in the chat saying, Mary says, but weird only because it's different. It's not the word we're used to talking about the United States. Yeah, Ricardo has said, I think it's accurate, and her evidence supports it. Oh, that is key, Ricardo. This is the kind of phrasing or the kind of analysis you want to give. I'm like, in graduate school, that is she giving you enough evidence to support what she's saying, whether you like what she's saying or not, right? So that's an important moment. But let's see. Rory says, I think the fact that we think it's weird is what makes it such a good word to describe the racial hierarchy that is so evident here. Aha, aha. And then Albert says, I find it weird because Wilkinson's argument is presented in a demonstrative rather than analytical way. Yeah. Okay. So let's take apart some of the comments, some of what you brought in. Oh wait, Jared says, I think it is good to use caste because we have been conditioned to have a visceral reaction to the word racism. It, in a sense, is dismissed automatically by a large number of people without actually contending with it. Caste, however, allows us to wrestle with its meaning more. And I do think that's part of what she's trying to do, right? By naming the book Caste, by spending so much time defining it and talking about its key elements of it, I think she's trying to shock people into really engaging with these issues. And she does talk about, in the parts I haven't assigned, and later on she'll talk about how racism, for a long time, we've made it such a bad thing since the civil rights movement, right? We've made it a bad thing. No one wants to be called a racist. If I say anyone is a racist, people automatically will get defensive, right? There's an automatic reaction to that word. But when we have that reaction, it, in a sense, that it allows racism to continue, because then we can't talk about it, right? We can't talk about it with that kind of moral judgment in it. So that's what she's trying to do, right? It's that kind of shake the phrasing, the wording we use for it a little bit, to be able to get at these issues. Yeah. More aware of acknowledging the US and approaching that history. Yeah, and I think that's where her examples of like India and Nazi Germany come in. It's easier for us to look at other places around the world and identify the problem. This is a caste system in India, bad, right? A racial system in Nazi Germany, bad. What's happening in the US? Oh, I don't know, things here are better. Right. That's a normal reaction. That's the reactions we've been conditioned, that a lot of people have been conditioned to have when talking about the US system. But I don't want to ignore some of the criticism you're all like coming up with here, because I do think that let's see, that it's not a phrasing and an example, a comparison that's going to work for everybody. Right, this use of the word caste. One, it really, because it is so connected in our minds to a caste system in India, that reframing it for American history might be a jump too much. It might be too much of a leap to discuss, and that I think can be a little bit jarring, even in the way she's defining it. Let's see, Ricardo says, I think by calling it caste is to make the readers more aware of acknowledging the US and approaching that history. One thing I did question was, why didn't she use the caste system with Spanish colonialism in 1/3 of the Western Hemisphere? That is an excellent point. You don't have to jump to a different place to really talk about a system of hierarchy. In the Americas, with Spanish colonialism, there was a very clear system of hierarchy based on race. They had images, documents dedicated to putting people in a hierarchy based on race, right? And it didn't require using the word caste or using that example. That's an excellent critique, and I think it especially speaks to when we think of American history, right? Most American history classes, in fact, like a vast majority, it is rare that an American history class doesn't start with the 13 colonies in the East Coast and English colonialism. Even though parts of what are now the United States really began being settled by Europeans, if we're going to start with European colonialism, in other places. The Spanish were already in California. The French were in Louisiana and up and down to Canada, in Florida, right? Not everything has to begin with that, but yet even Wilkinson does begin with talking about the English in 1619 as being the date in which slaves are first brought to the English colonies. So that's an excellent critique, absolutely. Those critiques are important as we move forward with it. We don't have to accept everything Wilkerson tells us. We don't have to accept her analogies, her examples, and we can always choose to accept some of it and dismiss what's not useful for us in discussing these issues, right? So let's use the word caste for a bit, because she's going to use it. We can decide later if we want to use it or not, but because she's defining, she's writing about the 8 pillars of caste. So these are the 8 things that are critical, she's telling us, to understanding the system of hierarchy in the United States, right? And some of them are really self-explanatory, right? Like the way she titles them, it is very clear what she means by it, and others require a little bit more of an explanation. So I'm going to pull it up in the table of contents, because here they're basically summarized for us, right? In part 3, the 8 pillars of caste. Right? Pillar number 1 is divine will and the loss of nature. Who can summarize that one for us? What does she mean by divine will and the loss of nature are key to understanding caste? Pop quiz.
I think I may have an answer because at least casteism in India works very much in a way that kind of people have to believe that, and they do, is what I've learned, that they're meant to be in their caste and they're born to be there and live their life in that caste, do what they're told to do what they're supposed to do, and then in their next life, if they're Hindus, for example, they will be rewarded for this, which is kind of similar to like medieval Europe in some ways, that you will be rewarded for staying in your lane, kind of an idea, through faith.
That's an excellent way of putting it, is what she means. It's that religious connection. There's a religious basis to an understanding of hierarchy. And it is very clear in the Indian system, in especially in Hinduism, where you have to behave according to your caste in order to do better in your next life, right? Because the idea is that you did something in your past life to earn your current status. And how you move out of that is by behaving accordingly. Right? Yes. Again, that is my understanding of Hinduism. Although I guess in modern Hinduism, it might be a little bit more flexible, but especially my understanding of ancient Hinduism, that is it. Ricardo is adding, and how she connects it to the US is by saying that it's in the Old Testament. By saying there is a religious understanding for race in America that gets used, right? That the interpretation of the Old Testament is that some people are born different, right? Noah, the sons of Ham, right? That this is how the Bible, the Christian Bible, explains racial difference, right? Ricardo says that there is a connection between religion and reinforcing a system of hierarchy and maintaining it. Jared says Enlightenment era thinking created a scientific framework of justification for the racist policies of the rule of law. Jared, are you saying that as as like further evidence of this, or are you critiquing the pillar number 1? I'm wondering if
further evidence. I mean,
okay.
I think that the scientific framework of Enlightenment era was still very rooted in religion. It was very like, yeah. Even though it was science-based, it was still like based on a notion of like closed meaning and like Christian-based science.
Yeah, this was some of the things that a lot of the scientists that tried to define race and define Blackness as, not as good as whiteness, didn't even realize. They thought they were being scientific and following the scientific method, when in reality they were not actually doing science. It was totally letting their biases completely dictate their work. But yeah, we can absolutely see it in that way. Did I see a hand? I know I didn't miss. Okay. So let's get to Mary, to what you're talking about here. So pillar number 2. Oh, wait, I don't want to miss any comment on religion. Ricardo says, for examples, how Catholics in Spain, in the Spanish colonies, and Puritans in the English colonies viewed themselves, such as they believed in the right religion and the right God. So therefore they are superior compared to the spiritual practices of indigenous people, the stereotypes of natives being viewed as savages. Yes. And this is something that I have found is missing from the discussion of caste in this book, and even from some of the other readings I've been doing and will be doing. And when we're talking about race in the US, oftentimes we forget that one of the first encounters in what is now the US is between these Europeans and Native people. Right? And right away, there is a ideology of difference and morality associated to that difference, right? Of we are better than them, and religion had a lot to do with that. Yeah. And then to Mary's point, the second pillar is heritability. So basically that you can inherit your position in the hierarchy, right? It is not based on what you have done. You are born into your place in the hierarchy, right? But with the distinction here being different to that, in places like India, it's the father that passed on the status to the children, whereas in the US, it's through the mother that a status was passed down, or at least in a system of slavery, right? If your mother was a slave, the children are enslaved, right?
Yeah, because I remember you making that a very, like, I guess, a very vivid point with us in the first class about the status being passed down in the US. So it just stood out for me. And
yeah, no, and it has always stood out to me, right? Because it went against the patriarchal ideals of the time. It was a patriarchal society. And yet, so then this means then that the system of race hierarchy was more important really to establishing that hierarchy than patriarchy, because they were willing to bend, right, those patriarchal ideals and have the mother pass the status in order to benefit the slave system. Yeah. And then, the Christians were to replace the so-called savages in the Americas. Absolutely. I think it's in that chapter where she also starts making a comparison to Nazi Germany. Right. In a previous chapter over here, The Evil of Silence, she had completely focused on the Nazi comparison and how the Nazis had really looked at the US as the example for how to define racial difference, right? The Nazis were trying to figure out how to legally define somebody as Jewish. How much Jewish background or ancestry did someone have to now legally be considered a Jew? And they thought that the American system of defining Blackness was too extreme, right? Because in a system of slavery, one drop of Black heritage and you were Black. And she makes that point to kind of emphasize how terrible the system is, that it was even too extreme for the Nazis. I don't always like the Nazi comparison, but that's what she's doing with it here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The Nazis were heavily influenced by a Jim Crow system. Jim Crow and also Californian eugenics. They were coming to our state to figure out how to implement their eugenics policies. Yeah. So that's important. And so what do we think right there? So far, you're following her with these are key elements of defining a racial hierarchy in the US, right? The KKK and the Nazis. Oh, yeah. The Nazis, yes. I mean, and then the KKK after World War II will glorify the Nazis. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we were at the cutting edge of eugenics. There was no question of that. The Nazis ended up taking over, but we were developing the science of eugenics in California. Yeah. All right. Pillar number 3 is a little bit, because she uses this word endogamy. She says pillar number 3, another key element of the caste system in the United States is endogamy and the control of marriage and mating. What does that one mean?
Like basically they would never, they would not allow people of different races to get married and like mate with each other. Exactly.
Laws regarding interracial marriage. And I talked about that with you guys too, right? I talked about it with my other class for sure, but about how important, regulating who was having sex with who was, even before the establishment of like the nation of the United States. These anti-miscegenation laws, yes, it was race mixing, making race mixing as illegal, right? That was necessary in order to maintain the purity of whiteness. That was the ideology behind it, right? If people are intermarrying, if they're having children together, then the idea was dilutes whiteness. It's no longer everything it's supposed to be. Yep, even to ensure whiteness. That was the goal always. If Blackness is at the bottom of the hierarchy and whiteness at the top, then any mixing is gonna mess with the system. Because what do you do with interracial people? Right? It automatically places the system in conflict. And so that's why all those marriage and sex had to be regulated in Nazi Germany, in the US, and in India as well. There are laws about marriage. And that speaks to pillar number 4, purity versus pollution. Right? Purity versus pollution. And that is why the racial groups had to be kept separate too, right? Not only can't you allow mixing, racial mixing, but even using the same facilities was too much pollution, too much racial pollution, right? That reinforces the importance of things like segregation and Jim Crow laws. The pools, yeah. Some of these things didn't even go away with the end of Jim Crow, right? Like African Americans couldn't donate blood to a white patient. They had to keep when people donated blood, they had to keep the blood separate because white people were not allowed to receive Black blood, even though there's no actual difference in the blood. Yeah, the whole different buses. Yep, the cemeteries were segregated. Some of it is quite ridiculous, right? Not practical at all. But it was because this was such a real issue. Yeah, from birth to death, everything had to be so strictly regulated. Yeah. And that starts speaking about pillar number 5, which is occupational hierarchy, right? And that one I can summarize as, people at the bottom of the hierarchy should not have access to the same jobs as people at the top of the hierarchy, right? This is why the master of the plantation is not going to do physical labor. He's not going to do the same kind of physical labor. That's what the slaves are there for. But also other kinds of jobs, right? That's why discrimination is part of the system. So even in places where there wasn't specific Jim Crow laws and segregation laws, there was still discrimination in who could access what kind of employment. Blacks only got menial jobs and could not move up. Yeah. And like even things like what Malcolm X talked about with going to his teacher and saying, I want to be a lawyer. And the teacher's reaction being, let's be more realistic. Why tell a kid he can't be a lawyer? Even if it's not realistic, what is it to the teacher? But that was such a intrinsic part of the system that like, no, Black people don't become lawyers, although there were, right? And in that sense, anybody who broke with the system, right, was an outlier, not part of the system. It's like the exception. And Caste also related it how knowledge which people have. Yes. Who gets to learn how to read and write? Who gets to go to school? Who gets to go to good schools? Right. Pillar number 6, dehumanization and stigma. I think that one's also very, very clear, right? At every step of the way, right? How race defined how much humanity was recognized in public, right? Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. will both talk extensively about that dehumanization aspect, right? Even to what you call people, right? Why people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King highlight that, being called boy was dehumanizing. terror as enforcement. What does she mean that? Cruelty as a means of control. Lynchings and violence. Violence as being a key part of maintaining the system. Anyone that tries to change, upend the hierarchy in any way, shape, or form was going to be met with violence. Yeah. Very obvious in like the case of Nazi Germany, right? But also clear, she identifies examples in India and in the US, lynching, state-sanctioned violence, the police force, how they maintained a system of Jim Crow and of segregation. Yeah, and the concentration camps as being kind of an extreme example, but in the way she compares it, not that much different than what African Americans are experiencing in the US. And then the pillar number 8, inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority. And that's the key to a hierarchy, right? The idea is that those at the top of the hierarchy are just better. There's nothing they've done. They're just, by virtue of having been born into this, into whiteness, in this case, they're better. And people at the bottom are inherently less, inherently need the upper class, the people at the top of the system to show them how to behave, how to do things properly. I mean, white people thought in the US thought that after the end of slavery, that the Black race was so inherently corrupt, morally corrupt, and morally inferior, that by the year 2000, there would be no more Black people. They just thought there's just not going to be any more of them by the year 2000. They were wrong. They were wrong, but it's that racist ideology that made them think this way, right? So I don't know. What do you make of these 8 pillars? Useful? Not very useful? Okay. Yeah, Mary?
Like to me, the Nazi one, like that was very eye-opening, because like I had learned in my my other previous history class about like the Nazis. Like I had known that, yeah, they had basically modeled after the eugenics and all that, and that was very shocking when I learned about it, but I didn't learn in detail how much.
Yeah.
And that was very,
that's going to detail. Yeah.
It's very eye-opening and very disgusting, honestly. Like,
yeah, and in fact, for anybody that didn't read some of the earlier parts, if you're interested more in it, the chapter in which she does that is really interesting. She does a good job of like point by point specifically talking about those comparisons. It's chapter 8, the Nazis and the acceleration of caste. So she goes in and talks about like specific meetings the Nazi had to discuss specific laws in the United States and whether or not they could get away with them in Germany. And that really highlights, even to the point when you think we tend to think of the Nazis as the worst people ever. And like, wait, they thought our system was extreme.
yeah, they even thought like some things were like too much. Like they're like, wait, they're even doing this to like when people die, when people are like living, like how they're eating, drinking like this. And that's where,
yeah,
like that's crazy to think, but it's like like even the beginning of the book, like I read it from the beginning of the book. Like I didn't want to start from the middle of the book, but I read from the beginning. But it was just like, man, this book is depressing. But it's like, no, the US history is depressing. Like that's the reality of it. And like, so this book is useful to learn the back history. And like, so this book is useful. And so
Yeah. And I think that's why it's had a lot of popular appeal, right? The waiting list at my library is like 10 people per copy of the book. I think, and also some of it is her writing style. She does write in a rather approachable way. I thought, what did you guys think? Is she readable at least? Yeah, right. I found her readable. If you're not used to reading history, though, maybe it was not. Maybe it was not, in which case it's totally fine. You'll get used to it. And you'll get used to her tone and her way of writing. Yeah, she writes giving a lot of examples, a lot of comparisons. And if they don't work for you, you can just note the stuff that doesn't work. You can always ask questions about it in class, or a lot of times what I do when something doesn't quite work for me is I just ignore it. I'll be honest. If something doesn't completely work for me, I jot it down and I ignore it, and I focus on what works. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I haven't checked, but I bet this book is banned in some places. I'm like, should we bet on whether it's banned or not? I mean, some of the stuff they're banning is so, like, when I read that they were banning Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, and I was like, it's not even about the US, it's about South Africa. But okay. It's got to be banned somewhere, absolutely. Okay, let's finish talking. So we'll come. All of the 8 pillars, by the way, everything, the way she talks about American history is going to keep coming back, right? Because these are the things that had already been ingrained. By the time we get the beginnings of a civil rights movement, these are already core parts of what being Black in the US meant, what things that people had to deal with on a regular basis. It is. Oh, it's banned in Texas. Surprise, surprise. Well, and mostly, honestly, anything that's going to talk about race is going to be banned in some of these places where they're creating book lists of things they want to ban in K through 12. They're very clear that they are not banning it from any bookstore or anything. They're only banning it in schools. But okay, let's get back to who's fighting this and how are they fighting this system of hierarchy. Inherently, people knew, right? For Black Americans, they knew that this system is wrong. For many white Americans, this system was clearly wrong, right? We don't want to forget that as long as this system of racial hierarchy has existed, there have also been people who fought it. Right? This is why sometimes I don't give people the benefit of the doubt or historical figures. I don't just dismiss them or the racist ideas as having been of the time. I'm like, yeah, they were common at the time, but there were alternatives sometimes. Sometimes I'm like, no, I will judge you. I might be unfair at times, but that's all right. We can discuss some of those examples as they come up. So let me go to, I didn't have it up, to where we left off with the PowerPoint. Wow, I'm like, what? Do I have every window open? I was working on our Canvas course. That's why I have so many windows open before our class. So we left out talking about the NAACP and how it exponentially grows during the World Wars, and especially after World War II, right? Just incredible growth and multiracial membership, right? People from all over, of all kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds can see that the system of racial hierarchy is not working, right? When you have soldiers coming back from serving in the war and are getting lynched, right? Some of them were lynched in uniform. It is very clear that something is very, very, very wrong. Right? It's hard to turn away from that. For a lot of people, that was the case. Yes, in the March on Washington. So this March on Washington movement begins before the March on Washington we think of. We tend to associate the March on Washington with Martin Luther King Jr. and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But this was before, right? This was A. Philip Randolph organizing the March on Washington movement. And this is different than the NAACP and what other groups are doing, in large part because it appealed well, one, it was an all-Black movement. White members were not allowed in the March on Washington movement. He said, no, this is going to be a Black movement. So very different than in the NAACP right away. But also, Philip Randolph was a union leader, and he spoke a lot more to working class Black Americans. Right? The NAACP tended to be made up of a lot of middle class people. People who, right, it's founded by a lot of, by some intellectuals, by lawyers, by people who want to challenge and have the means to challenge the law and have political connections, right? The founders of the movement. For A. Philip Randolph, he was appealing really to the masses, right? To the masses, especially the working class, poor Black masses. And his main goals, the main goals of the movement was desegregation in the armed forces, right? And discrimination in government contractors. So it's really related to the military mobilization that was happening. Right now, this is happening before the US enters the war. World War II is already happening both in the Pacific and in Europe. The US hasn't entered officially. Right? So he plans for this March on Washington to occur June 1941. As FDR is trying to make his case to the American people that the US should enter this war. It was perfect timing, really, because FDR cannot afford to have really any dissent to his government. Right? He's dealing with some of the dissent to the New Deal and all of that, but as he's getting ready, as he's prepping the American public for war, he can't have thousands of people marching in Washington. And so he calls up A. Philip Randolph and personally asks him to not go on with the march. They'd already had thousands of people signed up willing to march, right? As a result of the negotiations between A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement and FDR's government, they actually do get an executive order from FDR. FDR issues Executive Order 8802, which created the Fair Employment Practice Committee, FERPC, to investigate cases of employment discrimination. Now, he's only addressing, the executive order really only addresses one element of the things the movement was asking, but it was good enough for A. Philip Randolph and the movement, and so they canceled the March on Washington. What do you think? Did they do the right thing? Does the executive order sound like something big enough to cancel the march? We can disagree on this because I look at it and I'm like, well, we have the benefit of hindsight. I can tell you that this committee was actually formed. How effective the committee was very limited. Most of the 2/3 of the cases that were brought to the committee, right, people filing grievances of discrimination, were automatically dismissed as not relevant. Of the 1/3 of those cases, only a few actually got any kind of action. Yeah, Ricardo. So I tend to think of it as, yeah, it was a kind of olive branch, a carrot to throw at the movement because he really needed them to, he thought he really needed them to stop. Right? It was not very effective in the immediate aftermath. Yeah, there were thousands of grievances filed to the committee, and most of them were not even looked like, they didn't even examine or investigate most of the cases that were brought to them. Jeremy, you dislike FDR? Okay, later I'm gonna have to ask you why you dislike FDR. he tends to be, even bipartisan, get a lot of love, but but yeah. But it's part of that, right? This tactic of the marching in Washington, of thousands of people showing up for a cause, that's something that Martin Luther King Jr. is going to borrow from, right? And in terms of building a political movement, these kinds of tactics and kind of the existence of these tactics and testing the tactics beforehand is so important. When you're going to use something that has never been used before, right? A strategy that hasn't been used before, you really have no clue what's going to happen. With something like this, they already knew, right? The civil rights movement, the NAACP, they knew that this was an effective way of getting people together, that people would sign up to go march on Washington, right? Because the March on Washington movement had gotten people committed and willing to do it. And it got the attention of the politicians. It's actually going to be even more effective than that, because it's once you actually do the thing, it had a lot of cultural significance as well. But in that sense, the testing out of this strategy worked, right? It showed that something like this could work. There was also other groups. This ends up being a little bit smaller. It's the Congress of Racial Equality, which was founded in 1942 in Chicago, right? And their main approach is direct action, doing something specific, targeting specific laws, specific policies, and nonviolence. So Martin Luther King was not the first one to use this approach, right? The Congress of Racial Equality Corps was already practicing this, and they had actually been very effective in desegregating restaurants and movie theaters in places like Detroit, Los Angeles, Denver, and Chicago. What's interesting here, as I'm looking at it, so this was an urban movement. It was based in cities, right? And it was working in the cities where there was desegregated restaurants and movie theaters. But it's being tested in all these cities, and it's actually kind of brave to then apply it in the South. But we know it's gonna be an effective strategy in the South eventually too. But again, it was a strategy that had already been tested, proven to be effective, and will continue to be effective. But effective, we'll get to next week why the sit-ins, for example, are so effective at the time and why they might not be so effective everywhere. But in the moment here, we're talking about a proven effective strategy. Also extremely relevant in telling this story is once the war breaks out and we go to war with Japan, the US focuses on war in Europe first, but war with Japan plays a huge role in shaping the war for the US as a war about race. Right? For Nazi Germany, it was definitely a war about race and land. For Japan, it was a war about race and land, but it was also a war, like race played a key role in the way the US approached the war. Very evident by the internment of Japanese Americans in the US. Something that has actually not been known until I think it's in the last 10 years that this came out. Before war breaks out with the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR had been preparing, right? He knows this is going to happen. He actually sent Curtis Munson, he was a State Department guy, to come to the West Coast where most Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans lived, right? And he is ordered to investigate what will happen when war breaks out with Japan. What are these people going to do? Are they going to be loyal to the US, or will they shift their loyalty to Japan and the emperor? So this is a kind of early version of the CIA, in that they sent in spies into these neighborhoods and to talk to people. Curtis Munson issues a 25-page report in which his spies revealed that even if the US were to go to war with Japan, that most Japanese Americans, Japanese immigrants would remain loyal to the United States. The report is written and it's seen by the highest levels of American government. It is very likely that FDR did see the report. Right. At the time, somewhere around 127,000 Japanese Americans lived in the US, most in California and through the West Coast. And yet, even though the spy said these people will remain loyal, FDR still issues Executive Order 9066. So we just passed the anniversary of the executive order being issued, but it's the order that authorized for the internment of Japanese Americans in camps. Right. Yeah, Mary?
Order never removed?
Was it never removed?
I'm under the impression that it was never removed, but I never re-verified, but
I don't remember off the top of my head, and I'm like, and that sounds like removal, like I should know, but I don't know off the top of my head. Oh, it was formally rescinded in 1988.
No, but officially, like
at the time, no. It looks like not. The community did receive, there were reparations in the 80s. Yeah.
So there was reparations. I understand that, but it formally removed completely.
We'll have to. I'll have
get
to
back
check.
to me on that. But
yeah, we'll get back to it.
I know there's reparations, and there was a formal apology and all that, and there was even a court case that went to the Supreme Court. But from my knowledge, from what I've looked into, I don't think that there was ever a full removal.
Let me look that up, but yeah.
I'd appreciate that.
Rory says, growing up, I had multiple teachers who were born, spent time in Manzanar, so the internment camp. Yeah, so that's the thing, right? Like, I remember learning about the internment, and like that was not left out of how I learned history. What did get left out? Like, I never got to visit. I'm like, we live in California. There were camps here. Like, I wish more of an effort had been made in school to like take us places like that. Although I know logistically, those kinds of field trips and things like that can be very hard to organize. Nathan had said, I wonder why German and Italian Americans did not get sent to internment camps. Yes, it was clearly an issue of race, right? It was clearly an issue of race here. They were not placed in the same, it was not the same approach, right? It was not the same approach of let's round up every Italian American, every German American and put them in an internment camp. Japanese American families got, all of a sudden they would get a visit, and with something like this, a paper with instructions on what to do. And it's basically like, you have this amount of time, you must get rid of all your property, you can take this amount of stuff with you, and then taken into the internment camp. And the conditions at the internment camps were not good, right? Too many people than what the camps could handle were housed in them. Sanitation was not good. Just public health conditions, which were the responsibility of the government, were not maintained. Or you got to go to Manzanar, or we're learning about Russell. See, that is excellent. I think I'm like, I really wish my teacher. So what was that like, Rory, going to visit an internment camp?
It was really sad because a lot of the teachers who took us had spent a bit of time there.
Yeah.
So it was really, well, I mean, it was really sad going back with them. Yeah. And it made us all look kind of angry.
No, I bet. I always get very emotional and talk about, I don't have a slide for this, but the thing that also that gets me is that the American government, they needed men to serve. There was a draft. They went into the Japanese internment camps and they asked Japanese American men to serve in the American military. Not everyone said yes. The ones who did not agree to serve were sent to jail or put in prison. But most Japanese American men who were of the right age and health to join the military joined. All of them end up serving in Europe. They would not be trusted to serve in the war in the Pacific. So they end up serving in Europe, and a lot of them participated in the North African campaign. So the liberation of Europe through North Africa, up Italy, and they were among some of the most decorated units in the American military. As a result of, and this is like then the backlash, right, against Asian Americans. There was a lot of pamphlets and information that was given to the American public about how to identify Japanese Americans, all based on racist ideas that really actually had nothing to do with can you identify and distinguish Japanese Americans from other ethnic groups or nationalities. Was it because we were allied with China? Chinese Americans had to sometimes wear signs telling people, I'm not Japanese, I'm Chinese, because there's a lot of violence against Asian Americans. And American, I wonder if some Korean Americans got mistaken. Yeah, very likely, very likely. As a result of this has a direct impact on African Americans, right? Initially, right, there was a lot of unemployment within the African American community because of a lot of racism and employment practices. When the war breaks out, a lot of African Americans leave the South, primarily moving west, right? So primarily coming to places like California, Oregon, coming for wartime jobs at the aircraft factories and in shipyards, right? So there was plenty of jobs in the West Coast. A lot of African Americans were stationed in military camps in the West Coast, right? So most African Americans are leaving the South during the war are coming to California. So the Black population all over California grows exponentially during this period, right? In the San Francisco Bay Area, the Black population increased by 798%. Thousands and thousands of African Americans were moving to San Francisco because that's where a lot of these factories were located. Right? And with the internment of Japanese Americans, there was also a lack of labor. Okay, so there were jobs to be had. The Black population in Los Angeles goes up 168%. Right? As African Americans are also leaving the South for LA. And yet what they're encountering here is not always explicit segregation laws, but what they're really facing is discrimination in hiring practices and in desegregated housing. They weren't allowed to rent in certain parts. Right? So actually finding housing for a lot of these African Americans leaving the South was really difficult, to the point where really some of the only options for African Americans was the homes of recently vacated by Japanese Americans. So there were entire neighborhoods in certain parts of California that had been Japanese American, and with internment, they become Black neighborhoods. Right? A lot of people that lived through the time describe that. Maya Angelou's autobiography, the first book in her autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, discusses that. She was part of that migration west. Her family lived in San Francisco or in the Northern California area, and she talks about how hard it was for her family to find housing, and how her family ended up living in a house that had been vacated by Japanese Americans, and how that neighborhood all of a sudden became a Black neighborhood. Right? So it's this moment in which the policies towards different racial and ethnic groups in the US kind of converge to create this dynamic, right, of both opening up possibilities for some African Americans, but then the issue of discrimination and employment also becomes more clear. Right? It was just obvious based on the unemployment numbers, even in the West Coast. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll get more to, we'll get to the 50s. Well, we'll spend some time in the 50s overall, but next week we're going to focus on how the rest of the world begins to react to the US and how this affects the development of the civil rights movement, because it ends up being a key part when we get to reading specific elements of like Martin Luther King Jr. speeches, which we'll read next week. And then you'll see how international in nature his message was. Right? And that is because of specific decolonization dynamics. Right? So we need to talk about all of that next week. So we'll end here. Some of this information you won't need to answer the discussion board post, but don't forget it, because you might need it to answer next week's discussion board questions. Let me actually share my screen again. I missed that because I want to show you the discussion board post. It's due Sunday by midnight, but a lot of this information, if it's fresh in your mind now, you can go in and answer it now. I always tell people, don't leave it off to the end if you can get it out of the way now. But some of this, you'll see specific things about like the Wilkerson reading. It's targeted at some of the specific pillars, right? There are times in which I answer or in which I ask you, what do you think? When I ask you, what do you think? I really mean, what do you think? So give me an answer you think I want to hear. Oftentimes when I ask you that, there's not a right or wrong answer. I really do want to hear what you think. And some of it might get a little bit awkward, such as like I'm going to ask you about Malcolm X, specific things he says in there, and ask you for your reaction in that. In this one post, I also want you to respond to 2 classmates. Right? I think the questions will elicit meaningful responses, and hopefully then meaningful responses from that, but we'll see how that goes. I might not ask you to respond to classmates ever again, but it's good to hear what other people are thinking, and sometimes to change your mind about something, right? Sometimes if I hear somebody makes a point that I hadn't thought of before, it only helps me evolve what I'm thinking. So don't think that you're tied to any ideas you present here. You can always change them. You don't need to use them later on. Do you have any questions about this? The discussion board post, this will be the first one you do for me.
How long did you want it? Like, how many like sentences would you want it?
That's a great question. I don't care. Some people are very good. I tried to create questions that you couldn't just answer in one sentence. But some of you are really good to finding ways around my questions and can answer. If you answer the question fully, that's what I care about. Usually one sentence is not enough, but some of you are really good at what you do. So is there, okay, yes, Ricardo had asked the same thing. So there's not a minimum amount of words. Honestly, I don't know why professors do that, sit there and count. I don't have time to sit and count words. I read your thoughts, and hopefully they're interesting and they're thoughtful, and that's what I care about. Oh, I missed some questions and some comments in the chat. I'll try to answer those quickly. That was not part of the Great Migration yet, the move west, because the Great Migration is gonna be some movement west, but it'll also be to places like Chicago. So technically, it's a precursor to the Great Migration. Yeah. Oh, so Rory, I did not know that about Boyle Heights. That is interesting.
They had a really high population of Japanese and Jewish prior to, I think, the
To the
60s.
executive order. Yeah. Yeah. See, I'm like, we are totally shaped by historical forces in ways we don't even think about. But Mary, did you?
Yeah, just as far as to reply to the, I guess to our classmates, like I know that you say that there's no minimum, but like to the classmates, like
There
we have
really
to
is no minimum.
we have to elaborate like much.
I'm like, you're asking.
I'm just being honest. Like I'm just
No,
being
no,
honest.
I love it. You're asking me how much work do you have to do for it? And as a teacher, I kind of don't want to answer that because I'm not going to tell you to do less work. But I don't spend a lot of time reading your responses to other classmates. Is what I'm going to tell you. I mostly check, did you respond to two other classmates? That's it. Time grading. So you can be as strategic as you want, but this is your first one of your first most of you don't know each other, right? I think most of you don't know each other. So it's part of a process of hopefully getting to know each other, and hopefully I can create more opportunities for you all to spend more time together online without me.
What's important is basically our own reply. That's the important thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I spent time reading. Yeah, and Ricardo, I'm gonna it's the PBS documentary. Do you remember the name? You can tell me later because I'm really into documentaries at the moment. So I've been watching the one about Malcolm X's death. So there's a few things that are relevant to our class that I'll have to bring up later on as opportunities, either for extra credit or to bring into papers that are in existence. Oh, okay. I think I have seen it. Okay, not watched it, but I know of it. Okay. All right. I will stop the recording and let you all head out if you want to.